Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you to the Streatham Society for inviting me. As Mark has noted, we've got a really wide audience, which is wonderful. And had we been doing this talk as planned a year ago in Streatham, I know lots of you wouldn't have been able to come, so it's really great. It's also slightly intimidating because I've seen some very familiar names. So I think we have an audience here of people who know Streatham very well, people who know Piozzi very well, people who know her work very well, and some people who maybe don't know anything at all about any of those things. So I'm going to try and kind of cover all of those bases. But yes, so without further ado, I'll crack on, I suppose. So I'm here today to talk to you about the mistress of Streatham Park past. So many of you probably know the site, particularly those of you from the Streatham Society, even though the house is long gone. So born Hester Lynch Salisbury in 1741 or 1740, there's some dispute about this. I think it's 1741. She became Hester Thrale upon her first marriage and Hester Piozzi upon her second. And the name she's known on varies depending on who you ask when you're asking them about, including her to some extent. And there is an entire kind of, I suppose, debate around that in itself, which I mean, we can talk about later in the questions, but I won't spend too long on here. So Hester died at Clifton in Bristol on the 2nd of May 1821, which is almost 200 years ago to the day. So that's Sunday will be the 200th anniversary. So as you can see, as Mark mentioned, the choice of this date really was not accidental. So Hester is most famous still, I think, for her friendship with Samuel Johnson, although that is changing. Yet throughout her long life, and she outlived Johnson by many years, she formed many friendships with a number of famous intellectuals, artists, actors, writers and politicians. But that early period, which you could think of as, I suppose, the Johnson period, was of course very significant, as the relationships she formed in that period have, for better or worse, come to define Hester's popular reputation. So for those of you zooming in from Streatham, which I imagine is probably at least half of you, or from Wandsworth, Fursdown, Tooting, this was the period in which Hester also first resided in your area as Mrs Thrale. So for me, that kind of Johnson period, what's interesting for that time for me is the way in which that lays a groundwork for some of her later life and writing, which I'll talk more about later on this evening. So first of all, though, for those who don't know much about Hester, I'm going to say a few words about her early life and how she came to be the mistress of Streatham. So I've just got kind of a summary here, but I'll go into a little more detail. So she was born in 1740 or 41, we think 41, to John and Hester Salisbury in northwest Wales. She was a precocious only child, and she enjoyed the attention and praise of the adults around her, and this becomes a theme in her own child rearing as well, which again I can talk about more in the questions if anyone's interested. Her mother took great care of her education, and later at her uncle's house at Offley Park, her talents were encouraged by a tutor, Arthur Collier. As well as French, Italian and Spanish, Hester also learned Latin, and a classical education was unusual for a young woman. Frances Burney, for example, was anxious that learning Latin might make her appear studious and not properly feminine. And this unusual education contributed to Hester's reputation for literary talents. As well as translating, Hester began to write poetry of her own, sending both translations and original pieces to the London newspapers. Her earliest known publication, an American eclogue, was printed in the St James's Chronicle 1762 when she was 21, although it is likely that this wasn't the first of her works to be published because she did also send pieces anonymously, we believe. The young Hester was attractive and well educated, and she was widely expected to inherit great wealth from her widowed uncle Sir Thomas Salisbury, the owner of Offley Park. But in 1762, Sir Thomas remarried, and that inheritance seemed suddenly far less certain. So in the wealthy brewer Henry Thrale, Hester's mother found a suitor for her who was rich enough not to be concerned by her now limited expectations. Hester herself did not much like the match, and nor did her father, objecting that Henry Thrale was not highly enough born to marry his daughter, who, though poor, was from a respectable family. According to Hester's autobiography, John Salisbury remarked that his daughter was not to be exchanged for a barrel of porter. But John's sudden death of an apoplexy in December 1762 left his wife and daughter in dire financial need, and Mrs Salisbury pressed ahead with the match. On the 11th of October 1763, Hester was reluctantly married to Henry Thrale in St Anne's Church in Soho. And it seems that Henry Thrale was relatively indifferent to his new wife's literary talents. He didn't really want her publishing. He rejected her early attempts to court him with verses. He also objected to her riding or even cooking because he didn't want her smelling of the kitchen. So her role in the household was profoundly limited in lots of ways. Henry's main aim, Hester wrote later, had been to find a well-born and educated girl who would be content to dwell in the borough, which other women had refused to do. So the borough that Hester's talking about is Southwark, which at this time was an unfashionable industrial area on the south bank of the Thames. It remains on the south bank of the Thames, whether it's still unfashionable is a matter of taste, I suppose. So this was the site of the Thrale brewery and Henry's adjoining townhouse. And the image I've got here is actually, it is the same building, but by this point it's the Berkeley Brewery because it's been bought. It's about 1839, I think. Sorry, I've managed to cover up my own slide with the video. So this would be the building that Thrale brewed in. So while the country house offered a respectable home, the house in Deadman's Place was an unavoidable reminder of the trade that had paid for it. So the contrast between the good substantial dwelling at Streatham and the house adjoining the brewery in Southwark seemed an emblem in some ways of Henry Thrale's attempts to combine industrial success with leisured respectability. The son of a wealthy businessman from whom he'd inherited the brewery, Henry had been educated at Oxford in the manner of a gentleman. His marriage to Hester did not bring him money, but money wasn't what he needed. This well-born and educated girl did help him to cement his social status, and the house at Streatham would become instrumental in this. So although Hester's social life was restricted in these early years, she did prove herself a valuable hostess at Henry's dinner table. It is through entertaining Henry's friends that she would forge her famous friendship with Samuel Johnson, who we see here. So Henry Thrale wasn't a literary man himself, but he counted amongst his friends the playwright Arthur Murphy, and he was sympathetic to Hester's literary tastes. Murphy, in turn, introduced his friend Johnson to their set, rightly predicting that he and the hostess of Streatham would enjoy each other's conversation. Johnson effectively became part of the Thrales' household at Streatham, commanding his own quarters above the library and dividing his time between that house and his own at Bolt Court. This relationship lasted from his introduction to the Thrales in 1766 until just before Johnson's death, when, in 1784, the widowed Hester remarried against his advice. For almost 20 years then, Johnson and Hester lived on intimate terms, during which time she took charge of his care during his periodic bouts of depression. Gradually, the artistic and literary circle of Streatham expanded to a who's who of London intellectual society. The artist Joshua Reynolds, who was the first president of the Royal Society, the actor David Garrick, writer Oliver Goldsmith, philosopher Edmund Burke, the musician Charles Burney and his novelist daughter Frances, amongst other intellectuals, scholars and professionals. It was as the mistress of Streatham that Hester came into her own, and it seems that Henry ultimately came to value her for her intellectual talents for this reason, if not for their own sake. In 1776, he presented her with a 6-volume notebook inscribed on the cover with Thraleana, a title that mimics the French style of memoir, or Arna, that Hester particularly admired. Hester had previously kept a memorandum book known as the Family Book, in which she had charted the educational progress and medical ailments of her children. Thraleana, however, was to be something different. The first entry in the first volume of Thraleana explains the plan of this new work, as sanctioned by the dual authority of both Henry Thrale and Samuel Johnson, and this is the quotation that you see on the slide here. "It is many years since Dr. Samuel Johnson advised me to get a little book and write in it all the little anecdotes which came to my knowledge, all the observations I might make or hear, all the verses never likely to be published, and in fine, everything which struck me at the time. Mr. Thrale has now treated me with a repository. I must endeavour to fill it with nonsense, new and old." Hester's inscription at the beginning of Thraleana is modest. It diminishes the importance of the repository by reference to a little book, little anecdotes and nonsense. This modesty is probably slightly disingenuous. Although Hester speaks here of verses never likely to be published, we know that Hester had already published verses, and we know that she would go on to do so again after her second marriage, so she clearly had the ambitions to. Most significantly, Johnson had advised her to record everything which struck me at the time, which might suggest, kind of modestly, again, that the volume could stand as just a transcription of what was passing as it was passing. However, Hester's going to fill it with nonsense new and old, which suggests she's going to use Thraleana to shape her narrative, not just to record what is new, but also to retell what is old, and to produce something novel. Hester seems to have taken her husband's present as the encouragement she needed to embrace her creative talents. Hester's telling and retelling of anecdotes happens frequently in Thraleana, with the same stories reappearing several times, modified for emphasis or to suit the occasion. The Thraleana would also become the source of much of her anecdotes of Samuel Johnson, itself a further revision of these by now well-honed tales. One contemporary acquaintance, no doubt not the only one, Letitia Matilda Hawkins, commented scathingly that when reduced to fact, it was often observable, certainly to the credit of her invention, but at the expense of her correctness, that the worth of a tale or the wit of a repartee was furnished by herself. To contextualise this, Letitia Matilda Hawkins' father is Sir John Hawkins, who's sort of official biographer of Johnson. So at this point, Hawkins has been writing about her own father's biography and how correct it is, compared to Mrs Piozzi's, which is just, kind of this fanciful retelling in ways that make her look good. So I'm not sure this is intended as a compliment. However, although Hawkins probably didn't intend it, this criticism could be read as a testament to Hester's creative abilities. Her invention, her wit, and furnishing the worth of a tale. Creativity can be valuable. Thraleana documents Hester's honing of those abilities, flexing her creative muscles and sharpening her wit. Similarly, her growing acquaintance with literary and artistic professionals offered the perfect environment for the display of those talents, and her reputation for witty conversation cemented Streatham Park's status as a literary salon to rival those in town. The combination of elegant house and elegant hostess was key to the success of such a salon. It was also generally assumed that a location in the metropolis was necessary. But Hester's friendships with Johnson and others in that circle, and her own conversational powers, provided the intellectual credentials to draw company from town. And Henry Thrale's remodelling of the house at Streatham complemented his wife's abilities and her growing reputation as a literary hostess.
There's no way to go.
Excuse me, I just need that. Okay, where was I? So what the Thrales achieved then was a country alternative to the fashionable gatherings of London literary society. Many years later, Francis Burney would look back on Streatham as a coterie of wits and scholars on a par with the blue assemblages in town of Mrs Montague. So, as well as extensive landscaping work in the grounds, under Henry's ownership, the library at Streatham was remodelled and expanded into a comfortable reception room formed more for entertaining than study, with rooms for Johnson himself built in above. This library was particularly significant in the Thrale's project of establishing themselves as genteel hosts. To adorn its walls, Henry Thrale commissioned Joshua Reynolds to paint a series of portraits known collectively as the Streatham Worthies. So the image of Johnson above is from this series, and also the image you see in front of you here. The portraits included members of their social group who were eminent for their literary or professional achievements. And I think the combination of kind of literary and artistic and professionals in these portraits is really interesting, although not the subject of my talk today. I'm very happy to talk about it more. There was also, of course, a portrait of Henry Thrale, the largest presiding over the group. And the largest presiding over the group is this double portrait of Hester and her daughter Queenie. And this is a well-known portrait and you may have seen it before, but I think what's important about it is its situation in relation to those other paintings. So this portrait was hung over the fireplace with Henry over the door, kind of granting access to the room. And for those who are interested, Mark Hallett has written a really fascinating account of this group of portraits that recreates their arrangement in that room, which of course is lost to us based on things like sale catalogues. So I'd really recommend, and again, I can provide that reference, kind of reading what he's written about it because it's fascinating. So Hester was included then in this group alongside literary and professional men, but her larger portrait depicting her in her traditionally feminine and maternal role sets her apart somewhat. So sadly, of course, the house itself was demolished in the 1860s, and no doubt locals in the audience are familiar with the avenues of trees that remain from the Georgian estate, which was part of Tooting Common. Henry Thrale had inherited the house from his father Ralph, and it was as Henry's new bride that Hester had first set foot in Streatham Park. Mary Hyde, in her history of the family, describes the house at this time as not an impressive great house, but a good substantial dwelling. In time, both through Henry's extensive architectural improvements and Hester's social and intellectual talents, the house at Streatham Park would become significant as a centre for cultural exchange outside of the metropolis of central London. In this respect, the partnership between husband and wife seems to have been peculiarly successful, even though it was no love match. Hester seems to have admirably adapted herself to conditions of seclusion and restriction imposed by a husband who considered her in the light of an accessory rather than a companion. So this is all fairly well known, and I imagine some of you know a lot of this already, although it may be new to some others. And this has been the subject of a number of biographies and biographical fictions. So Hester Piozzi is still remembered, but she's remembered in particular ways. So in Beryl Bainbridge's According to Queenie, Bainbridge gives a fictionalised account of Hester's relationship with Samuel Johnson, using the authentic letters of her eldest daughter, Queenie Thrale, who later become Viscount Keith, Hester Maria Elphinstone. So she uses those authentic letters to frame her story. Ian McIntyre's 2008 biography, Hester, promises an account of what he calls the remarkable life of Johnson's dear mistress. The tendency to see Thrale's writing as a source of information about Johnson's life, and to imagine it only in those terms, is limiting, but it is understandable. After all, Thrale did publish a biography of Johnson after his death, and then edited a version of their correspondence. Hester herself was perfectly alive to the challenge of defining herself alongside Johnson and as an intellectual peer. In Thraleana, she describes their relationship as founded on the truest principles, religion, virtue, and community of ideas. But then she reproaches herself and she writes, "Saucy soul, community of ideas with Dr. Johnson." Hester's self-reproach here shows just how aware she is of the bold claim she's making for intellectual community, not only with a man, but with one of the most celebrated men of his time. Johnson's participation in that community of ideas could be seen as a threat. It could overwhelm her own intellect. She writes that he has fastened so many of his notions so on my mind that I am not sure if they grew thereof originally or no. I mean, there are some ways in which you could read this rather negatively, that rather than thinking for herself, Hester merely takes on the ideas that Johnson has fastened on her mind, that he's kind of planted there. But I'm going to resist that reading. Johnson undoubtedly is an intellectual authority, and by positioning him as a kind of tutor or mentor, then Hester can lend weight to her own intellectual claims by association. But at the same time, the confusion between the source of those ideas, as perhaps Johnson's, but perhaps her own, could be seen as a sign of intellectual equality. The kind of notions that Samuel Johnson can think of could just as easily grow originally in Hester Thrale's mind, which suggests that their powers of thought are comparable. Hester seems to be both proud of her intimacy with Johnson and aware of its restrictions, unable to entirely escape from his shadow, which I think shows an acute self-awareness and understanding of her position. Even after his death in 1784, Hester would still be associated with him in the public imagination, and it would often be to her detriment. So in April 1781, everything changes because Henry Thrale has died. And there's lots of speculation because of that intimacy with Johnson about his widow's possible marriage to Johnson. There's loads of speculation in the press. It's not really based on very much, although Johnson was an executor, so obviously he was at the house a lot. And the London gossip columns just kind of had a field day with it, really. So Hester, with the help of Henry's executors, sold the brewery at Dead Man's Place and continued to live at Streatham with her 5 surviving daughters, all in their teens. By September 1782, though, she'd fallen in love, and she'd fallen in love with this man. So you see here on the right a portrait of Gabriel Piozzi in rather later life. And I've put on the left 2 images that actually hang in the Houghton Library in Harvard and Cambridge, Massachusetts, of original paintings of Hester in later life and Gabriel. So you can kind of I don't know, I think he's quite handsome. You can sort of see why. And there's lots of lots of parodies of her and attacks on her as marrying this much younger man, but they were actually really close in age, and I think he might have been a few months older than her. So there's all sorts of things we could talk about in terms of the way women's marriage later in life is perceived. But she gets really attacked for this. Anyway, she's not married him yet. I'll get back to where I was. So Gabriel Piozzi was Queenie Thrale's music teacher. He was an employee of the family, and he kind of became part of the household. So Samuel Johnson, Frances Burney, and Queenie herself all strongly opposed this match for all sorts of reasons, including the fact that Piozzi was Hester's social inferior. He was a musician and her former employee. She was a rich widow from a good family. He was a foreigner and he was a Catholic. So regardless of the feelings of the couple, all of her friends and family thought Hester would be making an absolute fool of herself, and they also thought she'd be neglecting her duty to her daughters and to the memory of her late husband. For a while they persuaded her, and she abandoned the match, but the result was a nervous debilitation and severe illness. Ultimately, Hester chose to defy her friends and her daughters and marry the man she loved, which she did on the 23rd of July 1784. Johnson never forgave her, or rather didn't live long enough to do so. She engaged a governess and townhouse for her daughters, let out the house at Streatham, and embarked for the continent with her new husband. Hester was in Milan when she heard that Johnson had died on the 13th of December 1784. And that sort of brings to the end what you might think of as the Johnson period of her life. In many ways, though, Johnson's death and the rebirth of Hester's publishing career are yoked together. In stepping out of the shadow of Johnson and into her own literary career, she also memorialised him. In 1786, Hester, now Mrs Piozzi, published a biography of her friend, Anecdotes of the late Samuel Johnson, and in 1788 she published a volume of letters to and from the late Samuel Johnson. These marked the beginning of a concerted and productive literary career that Hester had been unable to pursue during her first marriage to Henry Thrale. By now, she had been married to Piozzi for 2 years, who, as a creative professional himself, seems to have supported her in her ambition to publish. Hester's literary career, restarted late in life after an abortive beginning, was ambitious in scope. As well as the Johnson letters and biography, she published poetry, travel writing, political tracts, works of British history, and an analytical survey of the English language. Her unpublished works also include 2 plays and a work of onomatology, that is the meaning of names. So William McCarthy, in his wonderful, cannot recommend it highly enough, wonderful 1985 literary biography of Hester, describes her as a literary fighter and argues that without support, against convention, she dared to claim for the female pen the major genres of writing. And this required not only more than ordinary courage, but also resourcefulness and cunning. Although Hester's work is now attracting serious attention from literary scholars, it is the Johnson-related material, though, to which her contemporaries reacted most strongly. Her biography of Johnson was a bestseller and avidly read, although it also drew criticism. James Boswell, whose biography of Johnson was released after hers, was particularly savage in his attacks on her, and there were personal dimensions to that, again, that I'm happy to discuss later. The feud between the various rival biographers became the subject of satire, as you'll see here. And Boswell and Mrs Piozzi were its most frequent targets. So in this drawing, the biographers, there's something really interesting going on with the kind of depiction of the various writers. So I'll read it out. 3 authors in 3 sister kingdoms born, so a reference to Piozzi's Welshness and Boswell's Scottishness. The shrine of Johnson and their works adorn. The first, a female friend with lettered pride, bears those defects which friendship ought to hide. Boswell's genius gives a monster's air, and shows his Johnson as men show a bear, etc. And there's a kind of criticism of other biographers, but ultimately the argument is that could the sage whose fame employs their pen visit his great biographers again, his 2 good friends would find him damned uncivil, and he would drive the poet to the devil. So there's a real sense here that Johnson objects to being written about. He doesn't want these kind of inferior writers, is the implication, to write his life. So that's kind of what the text is doing. But what the image is doing is fascinating to me. Piozzi is the only one connecting with the gaze of the bust of Johnson here. He's sort of looking down on her. The others are looking away from him. And she's sort of languidly lying with her hair loose in a kind of what you might call a state of undress, in a kind of casual robe. And the text open on her lap only has the title written in it. There's no writing. Whereas see Boswell's kind of nerdily scribbling every detail down. So there's a real distinction how the two are being portrayed as literary professionals. But I think the most striking thing about this to me is how sexualised Piozzi seems to be here and the nature of that gaze. And it very much reminds me of 18th century portraits of women who've kind of stopped in the midst of reading a novel with it kind of falling out of their hand in a state of undress. So that's kind of one form this satire has taken. Another is in the form of satirical poetry, such as, I mean, there's lots of these. There's Dr. Johnson's Ghost, which comes back and haunts his biographers. Sir John Hawkins sits as a judge on the trial of this. There's also the satirical poem Bozzi and Piozzi, or the British biographers, in which Hester is further advised to abandon her intellectual pursuits and keep to domestic feminine ones. She is told in this poem, "A happy knowledge of a pie or pudding will more delight your friends than all your studying." Hester's move into literature is here criticised as stepping outside of her prescribed and rightful role, in just the manner that Henry Thrale would never have allowed, although ironically he didn't really want her in the kitchen either. There is an implication here, not unrelated, I think, to her remarriage, that her literary ambitions are self-absorbed, that somehow they contribute to her being a bad and neglectful wife and mother. She's not doing the things she should be doing. I move on. Hester and Gabriel Piozzi returned to England and to Streatham in 1787. Her relationship with her daughters, which was always difficult, was by now almost non-existent, although they do kind of reach a kind of rapprochement later on. She did, however, begin to re-establish the conversational circle of Streatham, with some faithful friends from younger days and some new faces, including the author Hannah More, leading actors John Kemble and Sarah Siddons. Although she never quite regained the celebrated status she enjoyed as Mrs Thrale, her creative life remained as rich as it had been during her travels through Europe, an account of which she published in 1789. In 1795, though, she left Streatham and left for the last time, and with Piozzi returned to the Wales of her childhood, where she and Gabriel lived happily in their home Brimbella until his death in 1806. Here, Hester continued to write prolifically, especially poetry, and used this to explore her Welshness, of which she was particularly proud. And if you have any questions about Piozzi and her kind of Welsh poems, I saw Liz Edwards turn up, so I'm going to direct those all to her at the end, because she knows far more about Piozzi's Welsh writings than I do. We're very lucky to have a room full of experts this evening. So in 1798, the couple adopted Piozzi's nephew, who was then renamed John Salisbury Piozzi, and made him their heir. After the death of her second husband, Hester poured much of her energy into young Salisbury's education, perhaps compensating for the coolness of the relationship with her daughters. In 1814, when Salisbury got married, she generously handed over Brimbella to the new couple and retired to Bath, where, although by this time 73, she still maintained an active social life. So by this time, Hester was considered a curio of a past age. She was famous for her association with Johnson, and she was more a part of cultural legend than daily life. And particularly, she'd been out of the country for such a long time and had then spent so long in Wales. When she kind of comes back to society, as it were, it's almost like this kind of strange reappearance or revenant, a word that will come back again later. So when Hester died in 1821, at the impressive age of 80 or 81, and again, there are disputes about this, I think she was 80, she left behind an incredible archive in multiple genres, and from the playfully anecdotal to the deeply scholarly, and her letters and manuscripts up until her death demonstrate that she pursued her literary career to the end. So that's my kind of whistle-stop introduction to Hester Thrale Piozzi and her very long life, some of which might be familiar, some of which might not. But where does that leave us now? And how do we find Hester? How can we, how do we, how should we remember her? When it comes to remembering Hester Thrale, Hester Salisbury, Hester Lynch, Hester Piozzi, it seems to me there are two very good places to start. The first of which is where, were it not for the pandemic, we would be this evening, in Streatham. So this is a photograph of my very own copy of this print, which I got for £6 on eBay, and I'm still quite delighted because it was only last week. And so this is the original house after, well, it's the house after Henry Thrale's remodelling, although this is actually a later image because it's after Hester's death. But this is Streatham Park as it was before it was demolished. So this is one of the places I think we could associate her with. Many scholars have rightly objected to her description as Dr. Johnson's Mrs Thrale, and frankly, as do I, but I would take care not to underplay the creative potential of her role as the hostess of Streatham and the ways in which it inflects her later literary output. The problem with Streatham Park is, of course, that the house, the one pictured here, is no longer there. There's no author's house to organise around for heritage organisations, although there's wonderful work being done and still to be done, I think, by local heritage organisations such as the Streatham Society, Streatham Antiquarian Society, who have organised things like literary walks. And I think that's still ongoing. That's really important as a way of kind of citing these people, even where the house isn't there. The memory of the Thrales and their circle is mapped onto the very streets of the area, in the Thrale almshouses, and the wonderful work of local people in maintaining the memory in the inhabitants is ongoing. So that's one of the challenges I'm starting to think about with my kind of new project that I'm trying to come up with at the moment. And I'd really welcome discussion about that with residents in terms of how Hester's memory might remain an ongoing part of the local scene. The second, and maybe in some ways more accessible place we can look for Hester Piozzi is in archival material, some of which I've already mentioned. So the vast majority of documents that she's left behind are divided broadly into two kind of main chunks. So at the John Rylands Special Collections at the University of Manchester, where I work, there are the Piozzi papers, and in the Donald and Mary Hyde collection at Houghton Library, Harvard in Cambridge, Massachusetts, are the Donald and Mary Hyde collection of kind of Johnson-related papers. And there's an awful lot of Thrale Piozzi material there. And Mary Hyde was an early biographer of the family. So there's a great wealth of material and knowledge there as well. And researchers who've worked on these papers will testify to their richness and their potential as a scholarly resource. And one so huge, I think, as to invite, may demand ambitious and collaborative approaches. There's been lots of talk in Piozzi studies. There was a round table hosted a few years ago at Bars by Sophie Colombo and Liz Edwards about kind of Piozzi and larger collaborative approaches to scholarship. And I really do agree with them that she's crying out for this. And since McCarthy's landmark biography in 1985, there has been a slow trickle of interest in Hester's work that has gradually increased to a more healthy stream. And the bicentenary of her death this year will, I hope, prove a watershed in Piozzi studies. So for the remainder of my talk, I'm going to focus on this kind of second area and share with you some of the archival research I undertook in 2017 in that very same Hyde collection at Houghton Library. So I was really lucky to be able to undertake this thanks to fellowship from the American Society of 18th Century Studies and the library itself. And I went hoping to understand more about Hester Piozzi's intellectual and social life in her later years, about which as yet relatively little is written. What I found increasingly was that the great strengths she displays as a hostess would sustain her in her later literary pursuits, which were products of memory, sociability, a sharp engagement with the literary world around her. I'll be moving into, I suppose, a more kind of academic mode going forward, just because otherwise I'll trip myself up. So I will probably refer to her more as Piozzi now, just out of sheer force of habit. There are huge debates around naming, and I'm more doing it just for my own fluency. So I hope you can kind of follow that clearly, but apologies for not kind of using all of the names in one go. It's just too many words. So as Stephanie Loser has observed, the narrative of Piozzi's later years tends to focus on two particular strands. There are two stories that get told about her, really. So one of these is the colourful, vibrant, and we expect not entirely age-appropriate Piozzi who danced on her 80th birthday, which we suspect was her 79th birthday. And the sad, deluded old woman who reputedly indulged a hopeless and embarrassing passion for the young and handsome actor, William Augustus Conway. I think both of them sound quite fun, but these are kind of apocryphal tales about Piozzi that maybe don't get to what she really was like in those later years. And that's a narrative that Loza herself redresses in her own work. And she points out it's one that's caused many critics to overlook the richness, the ambition, and the professional nature of Piozzi's later work. Her own examination of Piozzi's work of British history, retrospection, and also of her letters to Conway, show how Piozzi mobilised or exploited an aged persona of what she calls the garrulous grandma, what Piozzi calls the garrulous grandma. And it's to a grandam's garrulity that I wish to turn now, which is the subtitle of Piozzi's unpublished and arguably oddest work, although there is quite a lot of competition for that, Lyford Redivivus. Okay, and here is Lyford Redivivus. So, Lyford Redivivus, what on earth is it? This is the big book of names. So this was the main purpose of my visit. I went to Harvard to compare the rough draft and the kind of fair draft of Piozzi's work, which she was preparing for publication and never published. And yes, I did essentially just start calling it the big book of names in my head because it was much easier. And what I wanted to know was, what was her editorial process? What did she change when she came back to this text later? Because I'm very interested in revision, in retelling, and in memory. So for those of you who don't know what Lyford Redivivus is, and I assume that is the vast majority, lucky you, it's a work of onomatology, or the meaning or origin of names, which was based on an earlier 17th century work by Edward Lyford, which was published in 1655 with a very long title, the gist of which is The True Interpretation and Etymology of Christian Names. And what I've got here is them side by side. So Piozzi's is obviously a handwritten manuscript draft, and Lyford, this is one of 2 volumes. Lyford's was in 2 volumes. Lyford is a small early printed book, and they had copies of both, so I was able to put them next to each other, and just for scale you can see the difference. So Piozzi's Lyford Redivivus next to Edward Lyford's onomatological work is noticeably larger. Admittedly, Lyford's was in 2 volumes, but they're very small volumes. But still, she expanded this text massively, and not just in terms of the length of the entries, but also just in terms of the names she included. She added quite a lot. She had an entire section on women's names. So it's just generally larger and more expansive. It's kind of bringing something new to Lyford. But I'm going to go back to the slide I was looking at before on the letter J, because this is one of my favourite examples. And so what I've left this open on in both Piozzi's version and the earlier Lyford text that she's kind of drawing on is an example of where she really revisits and adapts the original text. So she kind of extends and changes the nature of what Lyford's doing in his reference work. So in the entry for Julius, which I'm comparing, rather than simply giving an etymology for the name, which, you know, she does in places, and she does this in Hebrew and in Greek and in all sorts of other very learned classical and ancient languages that she knows because she's amazing. But with Julius, she cites the example of Julius Caesar, something Lyford doesn't do, although obviously this would be a figure known to him. So she starts bringing historical figures and examples of people who have that name that might be interesting, and kind of general knowledge as well. This is typical of what she does throughout this text, and also in lots of other places. She gives examples of people she knows or doesn't know that have the name, both from antiquity and contemporary life. Why I like this entry in particular, though, is when you compare the fair copy with her earlier draft, the fair copy has something the earlier draft doesn't. It's the fair copy you can see here. So what she's added is what she thinks is a hilarious anecdote about somebody called Julius. You don't have a choice but to indulge me because you're all muted, so I'm just going to assume you're enjoying this and read it out to you. So, remember Julius Caesar. This is Piozzi's fair entry in the kind of the final version. Julius is a name in every nation, from having been a name of the greatest man ever produced in any nation. Sir Julius Caesar is among our good families, i.e. people get called Julius Caesar in our elite families. And Lord Clarendon tells a humorous story of Lord Tullibardine begging the then present minister, Lord Portland, to do something for a young officer, so-called. So Lord Tullibardine's gone to the Prime Minister and said, this young officer, Julius Caesar, what's his name, please can you help him out? The Premier said, "Give me some token to remember him by, and I will." Time rolled on, however, and nothing was done. Till after a few weeks, Lord Portland, alleging bad health and refusing to go to council, the Marquis, i.e. the Marquis Tullibardine, who'd originally asked him the favour, called upon him, and finding his friend under the influence of some strange terror, insisted on knowing the cause. "Why then," replied the minister, "if you must hear the truth? Thus it is. I found this paper in my pocket last night as I went to bed with these 3 dreadful words upon it. Remember Julius Caesar." "Why, they were my own words," answered the Marquis Tullibardine. "You wish me to remind you of my friend's son, and now there's nothing in your head but assassination." So maybe, I can't tell because you're all blank screens whether you're finding this as hilarious as I do, but I think it's wonderful. It's a really silly story that she thought, well, I must put that in as a gloss for the name Julius, otherwise how will people understand the name? And clearly the Prime Minister has here interpreted this as a really obscure Shakespearean threat. So it's got everything. It's got gossip, it's got Parliament, it's got literary references. It's wonderful. And it's so Piozzi, it's so characteristic of her. And this is absolutely representative, and not the only example by a long way, of the kinds of things that Piozzi would include in what was supposed to essentially be a reference work. She is no respecter of genre. She brings in her knowledge of public political figures, both ancient and modern, but she knows about them because she's in a position to hear the anecdote and she's part of that social world. So many of these anecdotes begin with, "Oh, so-and-so told me." So in this case, it's an anecdote told her by Lord Clarendon. So she's got the contacts to hear these kind of stories as well, that social world coming into play. And often the person telling her the story is actually the subject of the tale. So she's got a real connection to the people in this manuscript. And this is why I was so interested to read Lyford. I think it's a real shame it's not published. I think you have to have quite a specific interest to get all the way to the end, but it's wonderful to dip in and out of. And that's because the sense I'd already got from her earlier works, particularly one text called British Synonymy, was that Piozzi is performing quite an arch and clever blend here of scholarly and what you might call domestic genres. So British Synonymy, as those of you who know the work will know, is a publication that she tells us is intended for the parlour window rather than the library shelf. You know, she kind of downplays its significance as a scholarly text. But it's something you would have in the parlour. And her Lyford Redivives' big book of names, indeed all her later work, seems to be aiming for much the same thing. Another really notable feature, kind of allied to this, was how often she'd refer to authorities other than traditional scholarly ones or people of authority. So in addition to plentiful references to Hebraic and classical culture, she also draws really frequently on Welsh traditions and folklore, often recalling being told about these by her mother or her grandmother. Like British Synonymy, it establishes Piozzi as a partial outsider. She's British but not English, drawing on her Welsh heritage. She frequently refers to herself as Cambro-Briton or to our Cambro-British people. Very often, too, she will demonstrate her literary knowledge by making references to the fiction and theatre of the period, again as a supplement to, or sometimes a substitute for, more scholarly texts. More often than not, though, she just throws everything at you, anything she can find, whether you want to hear it or not. So far, so garrulous. So how did Piozzi imagine this work and its kind of value and its possible reception? What did she think people were going to make of it? Her own preface to the text offers some clues here. And I'm going to show you this, but there are 2 versions of this. There's the preface from the draft and the preface from the fair copy. And the bit that's only in the fair copy is in red, which I think is quite important. She writes, "I remember a gentleman who travelled, carrying with him recommendatory letters. On his return, the writers of them inquired concerning his reception. I was," replied he, "asked once to every house. I expect to be read once by everyone who has a name, if it be but to look for his own. And I do flatter myself, new names are wanting here by which Christians have been few names are wanting here by which Christians have been baptized, either in wisdom or folly, either by common custom or odd selection, by thoughtless levity or ill understood devotion. Surnames must be excluded, or the book would be too big for the subject, and it is at least cheaper for those who read when the subject is too big for the book." And this is the bit that she adds to the fair copy. "My predecessor Lyford received much applause for his work. which mine will not deserve because his came first. I can feel groans of sympathy from the academics in the audience. But mine is far more extensive and may easily be more amusing than a small pocket volume composed near 200 years ago and now scarce known in the world. Piozzi rather wryly suggests here that her work is of interest to everyone because everyone is in it. And rather shrewdly, I think, that people will look for themselves in books. I certainly went and looked at my own name. She also plays with scale here, contrasting the physical and conceptual size of the work and tying those to financial costs. So she's savvy, she's kind of professional. And as I mentioned, the second paragraph is only found in the fair copy, which suggests that by the time she came to revise this, she was increasingly conscious of having to justify her work. How was it different from Lyford? Why was she redoing this? She seems to be paying Lyford a compliment, but it's kind of backhanded. His work deserves applause, but hers doesn't, purely because he got there first. This can't be right. So what qualities does Piozzi bring that Lyford doesn't, according to her? Apart from being extensive, her work promises to be more amusing. The largeness of her task, outlined above, is now cast into relief by the smallness of his, with his pocket volume. This is what Piozzi claims to bring to us then, amusement and contemporaneity that Lyford's now out-of-date work lacks. The end result, applause. So thinking of that idea of applause, this kind of brings us back to the constant problem of Piozzi's pitching herself as an author, particularly as a woman, an older woman, a woman who's maybe fallen a little out of favour with literary society. And that even her idea of scholarship is a kind of performance. So as Laura Engel notes in her recent book, Women, Performance and the Material of Memory, connecting the archive with performance allows for the archive to represent more than the materials in the box and potentially make space for beginning to imagine the intangible performances surrounding historical materials. So that's what I'm trying to access, the performance Piozzi is having to make around these materials she's producing to be accepted as a writer. So Engel's writing specifically here about archives of women's own lives, such as pocketbooks, but she also extends this to literary and artistic engagements with their contemporary cultures. So she wants to unpick the backstage dimension of what she calls the onstage archive that remains. In Piozzi's later work, the multiple sources she draws on, anecdote, hearsay, memory, folklore, and scholarship, form a kind of composite that I think is comparable to the types of literary or artistic work that is often associated with feminine activity in this period, scrapbooking, commonplacing, or perhaps even collage. This performance is one that in many ways places Piozzi offstage herself and outside of narrative time, removed from the experiences and knowledge that she has gathered over her long life and presenting them to us. Yet Piozzi had always considered herself in the guise of a storyteller. Back in her Streatham days, she had compared herself to Queen Esther, the biblical storyteller, when summoning her friend Frances Burney to visit her. "Come to the banquet," she writes to Burney, "and I will tell my story." Her double role there, as hostess and narrator, points to that fissure in her identity in that earlier period. Her stories come from her social commerce with the world, but she has to step outside it and arguably not be of it in order to be the hostess in Henry Thrale's household. But she still has that role of storyteller available to her, and she embraces it with vigour after her second marriage and her release from the proprieties of that first one. However, there is that kind of backstage dimension to it, to put it in Engel's terms, about the metaphor of the visiting gentleman that we saw earlier in that quotation from the beginning of Lyford, that books, like people, need to be granted an audience. And once admitted, they need to perform if they're going to be invited back. The drive to position herself as an authority and an entertainer at once leads Piozzi to draw on the acceptable, or at least tolerable, figure of the garrulous grandame. And how did Piozzi imagine that audience that she's trying to get to invite her back? And what did they think of her? Was she a garrulous grandmother to be tolerated and humoured, or was she in fact an intellectual peer? In later life, Piozzi had a significant friendship with Sir James Fellows and his wife, and they conducted a rich correspondence, of which much can now be found in the Hyde collection. So much of that relationship consisted of intellectual or scholarly matters, exchange of news, poems, politics. And in particular, Piozzi had hoped that fellows would advocate for her in finding a publisher for Lyford Redivivus, the work that I've been talking about. Edward Mangan had already attempted to find her a publisher in London without any success. So she writes to fellows about this in May 1815. And there is an image of the letter here for which I apologise. I've got a much better phone now, so the photo probably would have been better, but this is the photo that I took 4 years ago and it suffers from the cheapness of my equipment. However, I'll read you what it says. So she writes to fellows in May 1815, "My poor luckless book, like a rejected lover with second proposals, comes creeping to request your patronage. Be kind, dear sir, and get it as happily settled in the world as you can." Despite the obvious and parodic language of courtship here, this self-parody is again kind of disingenuous. Piozzi at this point is clearly still thinking of herself as a professional writer. She's trying to publish, and she sees Lyford as a way of relieving some of her financial anxiety. Later in the letter, and I apologise to the Streatham Society, she refers to this, the maintenance of Streatham still weighs on her, and she refers to it as a gilded millstone. And you'll see at the bottom of the page as well, she notes it is such a place to keep in repair. So she's still maintaining Streatham in trust for her daughters and having to pay for it even though she's not living there. So it still kind of links to her life. Her illustrious past then as Mrs Thrale of Streatham continues to impact the old age of Mrs Piozzi, even though she no longer lives there. So in December that year, she writes again to fellows. Well, this is one of many letters. "How kind you were in thinking of me so, and sending me those odd names. I felt uncomfortable at the sight of Lyford. He looked so like a revenant, as the French call apparitions, but your notes showed me you had not abandoned every hope, or entertained much fear, as I have done, lest the latter publication should disgrace the former. If your brother's book comes to a second edition, command me, but I hope we shall have a second edition of himself first." A number of things are going on in this quotation. Firstly, the way she gives her book a ghostly masculine identity, like Edward Lyford has literally come back to life, which ironically is kind of what she's talking about, right? Lyford Redivivus, Lyford re-enlivened, brought back to life. But clearly she sent this to fellows and he sent it back with notes some months later, and it's kind of taken her aback, and it's like a ghost coming back to her. So the book and Edward Lyford himself become strangely interchangeable. And the way she describes Fellowes' brother, which I take to mean William Dorset Fellowes, is very strange as well, because he's published a book which is about to go into a second edition potentially, and that he does command her a copy of. But I wonder if she's also hinting at a second edition of himself perhaps being an heir, and that's something I need to follow up more. So there's a bit of punning going on with kind of books and people as well, and sort of reproduction and returning. So the book to which she refers is probably the one that's on my next slide in terms of his brother's book, which is Paris in July 1815, an account. So Fellowes is in the army, and this is his account of events. And this is a presentation copy that is given to Mrs Piozzi. And this, I think, is of interest because it counters that delusional old woman narrative that you so often get with the Conway story, which is the handsome young actor to whom Piozzi offered her patronage and who it was assumed she was in love with, like, you know, the foolish old woman she was, which I think is a really unfair narrative, although if he was terribly handsome, I mean, who can blame her? So the relationship between Piozzi and the Fellowes family, this suggests, was one of mutual affection and admiration, and not only the letters but also the objects in the Hyde collection attest to this, and these are two things from the Hyde collection I'm showing you here. So the image on the left is a presentation copy of William Dorset Fellowes' book that was specifically bound for Piozzi, so it shows that her command was heeded and in truly grand style. So this copy is bound in full red morocco, its covers and spine stamped in gilt. There's a painted miniature inset into the front cover that is a replica of the frontispiece of the standard edition. So it's in beautiful condition still. It's been really well looked after. And it's a truly gorgeous item full of colour and luxury. And I hope my photo conveys it, but in the flesh, it is beautiful, really beautiful, loads of coloured illustrations. So this is the gift, I think, of a warm friendship and one that is valued. The image on the right is a miniature of Piozzi in her final years that was copied on the request of Fellowes. So there are a number of versions of this image. So there's this one that's in the Hyde collection. There's another almost identical one that Sophie Colombo and Liz Edwards uncovered. I mean, it was there, but not really known, I think, in the John Rylands. So it's weird how these parallel collections have these parallel images. And I think it's really interesting that it has been duplicated in itself. So there's still some work to do, I think, on the provenance of each of those images and how they've ended up where they've ended up, which is maybe another story. But clearly more than one person wanted a miniature of Hester Piozzi, which is great. I do. I want one. So yeah. The reason I include these then is to reinforce the sense of the intellectual vibrancy of Piozzi's old age and the esteem in which she was held by friends like the Fellowses, who seemed to genuinely value her friendship and her work. So, to return to the figure of Mrs Thrale of Streatham Park, the conversational mode adopted by Piozzi in her later works echoes the kind of sociable creativity required of that hostess in drawing together the scholarly and the domestic, anecdote with ancient knowledge, biblical, classical and oriental derivations of names, alongside tales told by her foremothers or hints dropped in the pump room. This makes her a fit transmitter of Lyford's work of bloodless scholarship into something that is vital and relevant. In Lyford Redivivus, Lyford is literally revived, brought back to living, breathing being. So my final point here, I think, is that Piozzi's literary mode is absolutely dependent on memory, on anecdote, on revisiting and revision, and I think she would be so delighted that we're remembering her. She's equally conscious, I think, that she is somebody who might be remembered, and she projects with great humour and self-awareness, I think, what forms that might take, particularly in her old age, and she wastes no opportunity. So on that note, I'd like to leave you with the favourite thing that I found, maybe not the most ostentatious thing, but the favourite thing that I found on my trip to the US a few years ago. In one of her manuscript books of poetry. And this is a poem sent by Piozzi to her daughter Cecilia, Mrs Mostyn, titled An Impromptu on Bringing an Eel from the Bath Market, Mrs Mostyn's Birthday. And I will be taking a survey at the end to see who has received an eel in the post for their birthday amongst the audience. So the title, I think, is self-explanatory, but the wishes it contains seem particularly apt as a way of closing this talk. My best regards, that you may feel your birthday present in this eel. Like her I wish, like her I mean you slip through muddiest waters clean, of rich restoring powers capacious, and long like her of life tenacious. I think that's a wonderful image to close on, thinking about the aged Mrs Piozzi, and I hope that, like me, this Sunday the 2nd of May, on the bicentenary of her death, of this fascinating, tenacious grand dame, that you will raise a glass to Hester Lynch Salisbury, Hester Thrale, Hester Piozzi, because I really think she would have got a kick out of that. Thank you very much for your time.